Welcome, my name is Mark Treadwell and this is the sixth in the series of video clips that supports the resource entitled Learning How the Brain Learns, and you can download that free of charge from marktreadwell.com. In the previous video clip we looked at the four learning systems that contribute to our capacity as human beings to learn. Our first learning system is the ability of the brain to gather data from outside the body but also from within the body using our 23 senses. And that's a very efficient system generally speaking, but it's not actually very accurate when it comes to our memories of certain things, as we discussed earlier. Our second learning system is our ability to learn via rote or off by heart, and sometimes that takes repetitive learning and sometimes that can be a one-off situation where we just remember because of the intensity of the situation. The third learning system is our ability to learn ideas, concepts and concept frameworks, and that process is carried out by the relationship between the astrocytes in the brain, which are a dominant cell type in the brain, and the neurons, and they have a tripartite relationship which allows the astrocytes, the neurons and across the synapse to work together to actually develop understanding based on the knowledge that we've learnt by rote and also the sensory data that allow us to do the learning by rote as well. So we've got those first three, and our fourth one is our capacity to be creative, and that is leveraging our knowledge, our ideas, our concepts and our concept frameworks to actually create new ideas, concepts, concept frameworks and indeed new knowledge as well. So those are our four learning systems. And associated with each of those learning systems appears to be quite different memory systems. So not only have we not got just one learning system, but we've also not got probably one memory system. So the four learning systems in brief, if we look at data from our senses and also learning via rote, those both seem to be based on something we call episodic memory. So episodic memory is associated with our first two learning systems, and once again we have to make quite clear here that we're not 100% sure how this all goes together in terms of memory systems. So this is an emerging field of research, but researchers seem to believe at the moment that epigenetics is probably the way in which we capture memories. Now epigenetics is quite a complex process, but very briefly, what happens in each of the cells in your brain, and in fact all the cells in your body for that matter, is that every now and then the chromosomes inside the nucleus of the cell have got to unwind so that the cell can actually make copies of the code inside here which produces the proteins and the other cellular material that the cell requires in order to carry out the role it has in the brain or in the liver or in any part of your body. So that unraveling of the code exposes the code to other elements that might be happening in your life at the time. So for example, you have a frightening experience that produces a whole raft of hormones and chemicals in our bodies, and that means our cells are exposed to that, and those can actually pass through into the cell, and they can actually attach themselves to the DNA in making up your chromosome. And so when the chromosome has actually opened up long enough to have the protein mapped, it then spirals back in and collapses on itself again, and there's chemicals called histones that manage that process of opening and closing the DNA and closing it back up again. And in the process it captures some chemicals that were released during that frightening experience you had. And scientists believe in fact that that capacity allows us to form memories. And so at the moment epigenetics is our leading cause for short-term and our temporary memories. So when we're talking about episodic memory, we're talking about the capacity to have temporary memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. And the reason we have these three systems is because the brain doesn't know which ones to map. So unlike when we're mapping memories to do with ideas and concepts that are dependent on hormones, and the hormones tell the astrocytes which patterns to map, when we're looking at patterns with episodic memory and should we map those or not, There's no hormones present to do that. And so basically we store everything, just in case. But we store them temporarily, and if they're used again in a short space of time, then it'll go to short-term memory. And if we use them numbers of times, in other words, we repeat the process or we repeat the experience a number of times, then it might go to permanent memory. So the brain has different memory systems for each of our learning systems. So our first learning system is the ability to take data from outside and actually have a sense of our world through our senses. And the second one that's involved in there is our ability to learn via rote or via repetitive learning. And those two both seem to have the same system, okay, what we call episodic memories. So that's our first two learning systems taken care of to a degree, except the fact that if we have, for our temporary and short term, for our long-term memories, we're not sure actually in terms of exactly how this happens. There are two contenders, so to speak, for long-term memory for the episodic memories, and those are the ability to form a holographic memory. And holographic memory refers to the fact that if you actually take a hologram, and a hologram is a picture in 3 dimensions, and you can buy them at the Eiffel Tower and koala bears and a whole range of other things, and if you cut them into 4 pieces, you'll end up with 4 Eiffel Towers. And if you cut again and again and again, each bit you cut actually retains the whole picture. Now, why we think this will have something to do with the human brain is the fact that there's an operation called a hemispherectomy. The hemispherectomies are carried out on patients who have severe fitting and seizures, and they will die if we don't take out half their brain. So half the brain is actually totally removed. But the surprising thing is when you remove half the brain, and when I say half the brain I mean half the cortex, the 2 halves of the brain so to speak, one of them is removed and it doesn't matter which one in most cases. When you remove half the brain, you don't lose half your memories. At least you don't lose half your long-term memories. But your temporary and short-term memories can be affected. Your temporary memories tend to disappear entirely. Some short-term memories do survive and some don't, but your long-term memories are absolutely fine. So that tends to indicate that the storage of short-term and temporary memories is different to our long-term memory. And the whole idea of being able to take out half and still have all your memories refers to that sort of ability to store memories holographically. If you need more information about this, you can purchase the book entitled How the Brain Learns, and that's a resource that you can purchase from marktreadwell.com, and that explains this in much more detail. So holographic memory is one option, and another option is memristic memory. And memristors are actually electronic components. In fact, it's the final electronic component. There are 6 basic electronic components in the world, and memristors have only just been created, just in the last 2 years. And at the same time, it was discovered that a single-celled organism also uses a very similar process to a memristic chip in terms of memory storage in electronic formation. And then single-celled organisms can actually, even though they're just a single cell, remember things using a similar memristic process. And so those 2 processes happening in a chip, in an electronic sort of format, and also biologically. So we think that in fact the long-term memory for our sensory data and our rote-learned data is possibly formed by one or either of those 2 contenders. When it comes to our ability to remember the concepts, ideas and concept frameworks, that really seems to take place via the astrocytes. And the astrocytes, which we've talked about in some detail now, crowd around the synaptic regions, and they work with the synapses, across the synapses with the neurons, to actually know which patterns to map. And so we've talked about the nature of ideas and concepts and concept frameworks being about patterns, and that those astrocytes recognise patterns, map the patterns, automate the patterns, and the astrocytes seem to also be responsible for actually remembering that process as well. So the astrocytes store the memory of those things. The interesting thing with our ideas and concepts and concept frameworks is that when we build those, when we remember them, we don't go through a process of temporary, short-term, long-term. They go straight to long-term. If there's sufficient hormone intelligence happening in your head saying, map this pattern, this is really important, it happens straight into long-term memory, and you have that aha moment. And so the aha moment is actually the trigger, okay, telling your brain, map this permanently, this is really important, and the hormones are telling us this. So those two types of memory, episodic memory, for our data from our senses and learning via rote, and our second type of memory here is around semantic memory, and semantic memories are to do with ideas, concepts and concept frameworks. Creative memory seems to stem from the ability of the brain to produce brain waves. Now we're not sure who's producing the brain waves here, whether the astrocytes are working with the neurons or the neurons are doing this themselves. But we think with the rise in astrocytes as we get older and we get more clever, we think the astrocytes are probably telling the neurons to produce certain brainwave frequencies to actually search out our brain for other knowledge, ideas, concepts and concept frameworks that might work well together. We're not, once again, sure entirely how that happens, but we're pretty sure now that brainwaves are responsible for that, and the fact that astrocytes can't produce brainwaves on their own means the neurons have to produce them, but there does seem to be a lot of interplay between the astrocytes and the neurons, and quite probably the astrocytes are actually generating brainwaves via the neurons. So that is for our creative memory. So there's our 4 learning systems taken care of. But central to all this is another memory system, and that's our ability to associate different memories with each other and associate different actions with each other, such as my voice and my body. It's very important that you don't associate the vacuum cleaner noise with my body. And how the brain does that is quite extraordinary and quite complex. And so once again, we think this is partly what they call stochastic resonance. And stochastic resonance is where the astrocytes probably inform the neurons, we need you to generate this frequency of brainwave to actually search the brain to see if we can find other ideas, concepts, concept frameworks and knowledge and experiences that may actually link with this quite well. So that's our first possibility here, is stochastic resonance, and possibly also an interference pattern might be happening in there as well. Our second big sort of group here as well is also holographic memory, because we know also that when it comes to associative memory, we don't lose any associative memory once we've had half our brain removed, if you have to have that done. It's not a good weight loss program or anything, it's something that we only do when people are suffering severe trauma and fitting and seizures. So there's a rough overview of episodic memory, semantic memory, creative memory and associative memory. And each of those memory forms and types has connections to the 4 different learning systems. From that, what we can actually then start looking at is how can we maximize that? How can we leverage that knowledge, that emerging knowledge, and this is very much an emerging knowledge field, how can we do that to actually improve the learning of our learners? And that'll be dealt with in a video that's coming up soon. So thank you very much for listening to this, and hopefully it's of some value, and now you can go back and read the chapter associated with this in the text if you wish to, or you can go on to the next video. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch up with you next time. Thank you.